Hello, everybody. My name is Ratnos, and today we are going to cover a lot of Shadowlands news. So we're going to do Legendaries, that's a big thing that's happened recently, Conduits and Potency Conduit changes, and then a couple of other changes specific to the pre-patch, and a couple of other small class changes. So there will be timestamps in the description below, and also that should affect the actual video progress bar, so you can jump to whichever portion of the video you want to for that. Let's start off with Legendaries, though. And yesterday, a big beta build came in, as they often do on Wednesdays, and the basic long and short of it was many Legendaries, most Legendaries, except for the weakest of each spec, got cut in half or more than half. So, looking through here, like the Mantle of the Master Assassin, for instance, for rogues, was a legendary effect that we had in Legion that had this effect. And the nerf came in to make it 40% as powerful as the Legion version was now. Or you could look at like Frost Mage. Let's see. Dude, my M key is broken on my keyboard. Hang on. Oh, this is not it. The word mage is too popular. All right, hang on. We'll find mages here, and I can show you some examples of what happened to their legendaries. Okay, so like you can see, for instance, going from 30 to 40 fireballs needed here, consuming 16 instead of 6 hot streaks. Right, that's triple a nerf. A 33% as effective as it used to be type thing, and you only get 4 seconds of combustion instead of 6 seconds. So just a complete gutting of this legendary. This legendary effect here, Cold Front, going from 15 to 90 frostbolts is it is now a sixth as powerful as it used to be. So huge across the board nerfs here to legendaries that take the strongest ones from being, I would say, about on par with good Legion legendaries, down to being, fractions, shadows of their former selves. But don't want to spend too long talking about that development, because there's another piece of news that came out then about an hour later, where Blizzard made this blue post that says, "We are currently in the process of tuning legendary items, so in this latest Shadowlands build, you may see a number of them have had their power reduced, but we've recently had internal discussions about our tuning targets for legendaries and concluded we were aiming too low with respect to their power. We're working through another tuning pass on all these items. You should see further adjustments in an upcoming build." So hopefully this means basically across the board, the legendaries will be brought up to somewhere around good Legion legendary levels. I think that was a pretty impactful feeling, and I don't think they need to have legendaries be weak for balance reasons, right? Because you can compared to Legion, in Legion, you were stuck with whatever you got dropped for, particularly in 7.0, 7.1, up until 7.2 and really 7.3, you were largely at the mercy of which legendaries dropped for you, unless you played, 8 hours a day or more, and you could just farm all of them. In Shadowlands, that's not even the case, right? In Shadowlands, you can pick any legendary you want. So there's not even really going to be a huge balance issue if there are some that are better than others. So they don't need to nerf all of them down to be low impact, right? They don't need to make legendaries something that is a small portion of your power, so that the difference between the best and the worst one is also therefore a small amount. They can afford to be a little bit riskier there because of how accessible they are, because of how accessible legendaries are. Now, if they end up doing nerfs on, say, week 1 of Mythic, after you've invested your first legendary and your first legendary upgrades into one of them, that will still feel bad. It would still be ideal if they avoid needing to do balance changes to legendaries at the very start of progression, because players will have been kind of locked into their one Castle Nathria legendary or whatever. But besides that, outside of that one case, as the expansion goes on, you will really have access to any and all of the legendaries. So I think this is a good. This was a good realization for them to have, that legendaries should feel better than this sort of thing, right? 90 frostbolts is these effects are just they're too meh, and they kind of, I don't know. There's been this pattern for soulbind passive effects, conduits, and covenant abilities to nerf all of those down to make the direction that almost all of those are taking is the strongest ones are getting nerfed rather than the weakest ones are getting buffed. And I've said before, but I think this makes a lot of sense for covenant abilities and for conduits because of how restrictive they are, right? If you make the absolute size of the power of any covenant ability lower, then you make the relative difference between the good ones and the bad ones also lower, and that's good because of how restrictive they are, right? Because of how locked in you are there. But that restriction doesn't exist for legendaries. So I would love to see legendaries be where most of the power is of those systems of those systems, covenants, conduits, soulbinds, and legendaries. I'd love to see legendaries be the most powerful of those. Let's move on, though, to talking a little bit about conduits, because we also had some news about conduits coming in. So the news here was that Soulbinds have had their tree layouts changed in a small but important way. All soulbinds now have access to 2 potency conduit sockets, whereas previously all trees had 3 potency sockets. So this is a good change, in my opinion. That this makes a lot of sense here. Although, for the record, it's going to be irrelevant for most Mythic Castle Nathria progression, unless your progression goes on for many months into the expansion. I don't think you're necessarily going to get access to where that 3rd potency socket was in most of these trees anyway. So this is mostly just like kind of a longer term over the expansion type change, but it still makes a lot of sense here. The goal of this change is to increase the flexibility of soulbinds and make it more viable to use one soulbind for multiple specializations, which, my video recently was talking about how challenging that was. And now with 2 potency conduits, potency ones are the ones that are most spec specific. There are still cases where the finesse and endurance conduits are ones that you'd want to swap between different circumstances, but they're a lot less directly impactful on your throughput than the potency conduits are. To be fair, there are some potency conduits that change value hugely between AoE and single target. So even if you're trying to use one soulbind tree for one spec, you may still want to swap those conduits between, say, Mythic Plus and Raid. So that is something that reducing the amount of potency sockets on the tree, right? If you have 7 swaps per week and you're trying to swap 3 every time you swap, you only get to swap 2 times per week, right? 2 times plus 1 every other couple weeks. Whereas if you make it so there's only 2 potency conduit sockets on the tree, then you can swap 3 times per week, right? Or 3.5 times per week. So that's it's a lot better for the goal of making it more viable to use one soulbind for multiple specializations. There is another way that they could make it so that soulbinds are more flexible, and that is to just remove the thing, right? Remove the conduit energy thing entirely, right? It's, they come out with these changes here. They're like, the goal is to make it so that, we fix this problem, but like they have created the problem entirely, right? It's artificial. There's no reason it needs to be that way. So I still, I see this as another step in a good direction with conduits. But the thing about conduits is that it feels like all of this is progress that we're making back towards a point that it's not like we need to come up with all these intricate systems to make it work, right? We know what you have to do. You just remove the thing that they've added, right? They are the reason that that line they added about, first of all, the swap, the 1 per week swap, and second of all, walking that down to the conduit energy. Those are still. This isn't a problem that they need to design their way out of. It's a problem they designed their way into, right? So you just remove that design and you solve the problem. You don't need to like come up with fancy solutions like this, and you don't necessarily need to cut the number of I think that one downside of cutting the number of potency conduit sockets in the tree is that the more potency conduits there are in the tree, the more flexibility, the more diversity, the more options you have for how to take your build, right? Because the odds are pretty good that the first potency conduit is kind of locked in, right? But as you add more and more, as you go deeper down the list, the more you get to these spots that are more likely to have flexibles picks, right? The more likely to have one where you could disagree, where 2 good players could disagree about what the 3rd best potency conduit is, right? And that would mean that if there are 3 potency sockets, those 2 players would have a different build from each other, and I think that's pretty cool. But as you cut the number of potency conduits, you get to a point where, okay, if you only had 1 potency conduit, for most classes and specs, it's pretty clear what the best one is, right? There's not too much debate about that. So I do think that loss is a little bit of a shame, but serving this goal is an important one. This goal is more important than that. However, again, they designed themselves into the problem in the first place, so they could still just cut that code out, and it wouldn't be a problem. So that's what's happening with conduits. Let's talk a little bit about some other class-specific changes. Particularly, I want to talk about Rogue, Subtlety Rogue, a little bit of a Subtlety Rogue interlude, because Subtlety Rogue is something that I like a lot. And I'm thinking about playing one as a Mythic Plus character in Shadowlands. I was kind of wanting to do some Mythic Plus on my raiding main, but because of the conduit system, I am heavily incentivized to do my Mythic Plus on a different character than I raid on, which maybe means I'll play Rogue, because Rogue isn't something that can tank on, so I won't need to be playing it on raid because I'm tanking for raid. And that way, as long as I can gear up my Rogue, as long as I can find a way to do that, which will be a challenge, I will then be able to play Mythic Plus on that. And Subtlety looks really good right now, looks really fun. One nice thing they're doing here as well is they've changed Shadow Vault. So Shadow Vault was the new Subtlety AoE finisher, and you would do it every other global, and you'd jump up in the air and be immobile while you're jumping in the air, much like Windwalker monks with Whirling Dragon Punch. But instead of once every 24 seconds, it was once every 2 seconds that you were doing this in AoE. And so it's really nice that they are taking that away, right? They are removing the frustrating knock-up effect and making it so it's not just Shuriken Storm but with a jump. So the way the subtlety AoE worked is you go Shuriken Storm and then Shadow Vault, and it was basically the same animation, but every other global you were jumping instead. And so they're now changing it to launch explosive black powder over the heads of your enemy. Cool, good change. I'm happy to see this here. Little small spec specific news in today and yesterday's news roundup. Let's go to the final bit of this video, which is news from today rather than from yesterday, and this is pre-patch stuff. So there's a lot of information about how the pre-patch is going to work. A lot of it isn't too pertinent to me particularly, like stuff like the Black Market Auction House now requiring you to have a max level character. It's relevant. There are certainly people that are going to be affected by this, but I'm not one of them. One thing that is going to affect me, particularly in Mythic Plus, well, not me, but my healers, is water now regenerates mana slower in the first seconds you begin drinking, increasing to a rapid return as you drink continuously. So this is going to mean that trying to sit down for 3 seconds of drink is dramatically nerfed, right? A 10-second drink may be about the same, but a 3-second drink is going to be way worse than it used to be. And this, I understand the reason behind doing this. This is going to slow down Mythic Plus, unless it doesn't affect the sugar-crusted fish feast, which it might not. If it doesn't affect that, it's going to be largely irrelevant for high-level Mythic Plus, because that's the main water you use there anyways. But if this affects that too, then this will mean that you will need to be a little bit more cognizant of your healer's mana, a little bit more careful about how quickly you're pulling. And healers are going to need to be a little bit... One thing about Mythic Plus healing was that besides boss fights, you could kind of just burn your mana. It was an irrelevant consideration for what spells you used. You were just trying to maximize, throughput and damage, and you would handle your mana by drinking between pulls. But if drinking between pulls is no longer something that is a silver bullet, then that will change how play works. So I'm not a healer. I don't have a take on whether this is good or bad, but it's certainly going to be extremely relevant to how Mythic Plus works out in Shadowlands. XP potion and XP elixirs or whatever, all going away. Makes sense that they'd want to consolidate all this. Every expansion they kind of do some kind of weird new thing for XP that you get from some vendor, and it makes sense, I think, to turn those off and when you're doing kind of a leveling rework, which they're doing here, so it seems reasonable. You can no longer champion a mop faction for bonus rep, so rip. That was a cool system. I would have loved to see this become just the standard way that factions worked, where you're able to champion them instead of making it so that it was a mop only thing and now taking it away even from there. But maybe the fact that removing this means that something is going to go in its place at some point, or maybe just going away for good. I don't know. I don't really care about that either. Travel Form's ground mounts are no longer mountable, but Stag Form ability has been renamed Mount Form, and ground mount forms are mountable. Okay, I guess just mount form. So I guess you just have one that is specifically for being mountable. Okay, cool. Explosive Orb health. Here's another relevant change for Mythic Plus. Explosive Orb health has been reduced and no longer scales with Keystone level. So I've always been a proponent of Explosive Orbs changing how they work, because I think that right now in Mythic Plus, there's a huge disparity that can feel kind of arbitrary between how different classes handle Explosive Orbs, right? If you're playing something like an Affliction Warlock, and you see an Explosive Orb, and you target it, and you want to try and kill it to help out the group, there's a good chance that, particularly in a high BFA key, you literally there's nothing you can do. You are entirely at the mercy of the rest of your group. Even if you see the Explosive Orb and target it as soon as it spawns, you can't kill it before it goes off in a lot of settings. Whereas specs like Outlaw Rogue, you have your Blade Flurry going, you literally target the Explosive Orb, and you lose a tiny amount of damage on the rest of the pack, like a really tiny amount of damage on the rest of the pack, and you get to kill the Explosive Orb in like a global effectively for free. So extremely different class-based dealing with Explosive Orb, I think makes sense to get rid of that. My suggestion for this has been to make it so that they behave like totems do in PvP, where instead of having a set amount of health, they just require 2 hits of any kind and still aren't affected by AoE. So any 2 globals kills them. It looks like this change is effectively going to do that, except make it any 1 global. It seems like if it's no longer scaling health with Keystone level, the odds are pretty good that this will just mean that these things die instantly. There is a chance that since they're not scaling with key level, if they set that flat health level pretty high, it might make them a little bit more annoying in lower level keys, the levels where Explosive first gets added to the system. But my expectation is that it'll probably end up being about the same at worst in those settings, and much, much, much easier as the key level goes up, which I think is better than the old system. I still think that I think that there's room for there being some difficulty with explosive orbs. I just think that making it so that the difference between the best specs and the worst specs at dealing with explosive orb isn't as night and day would have been a good direction. Because even if you implemented the change I was talking about, it'd still be much better to be say an outlaw rogue swapping to them than an affliction lock. It would just no longer be impossible for the affliction lock to kill them at all. Either way, though, this is a good change. And then when swapping weapons, the off-balance debuff is applied and prevents the Death Knight from gaining the bonuses of Runeforge enchantments for 30 seconds. Now, if you're seeing this, you may be wondering what's going on here. Let me see if I can find an image to explain what's happening here. Okay, I found it. Here's a Discord image that's been going around. I don't actually know the source from this, but the rise of four-handed frost. So the way you would do this is you would use Obliterate and then immediately swap to a two-handed weapon instead, causing the Obliterate to be used with your two-hand without incurring the extra GCD, but you'd gain the buff of the other, like of the dual wielding, I guess. So you'd have this very complicated setup where you'd need to have multiple different buttons for some of your different abilities. But if you did this right, you'd end up getting some sizable advantages about from basically having access to multiple different rune forges and from having different like two-hand / dual wield setups. So seems like a good thing to make that not work. I believe that this is a change that is targeted at that, and yeah, this is the kind of thing where if you just see these changes, you're like, what is happening? Why is that? Why do they need to do that? And the answer is to stop people from trying to play, from needing to have like 5 weapons to play Death Knight optimally. Anyways, that's about it for this video. That's all the Shadowlands news that's fit to print for today. I'll be back next time there's a lot of Shadowlands news with another video like this one. And otherwise I have some other videos planned for whenever I get around to them over the next couple weeks as well. So stay tuned for those. If you liked the video, remember to hit like and stuff. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye. Oh, dude, last bit. I forgot about this, but last bit. They're disabling Covenant abilities outside of Shadowlands content, so you can't use stuff like Spear of Bastion or Door of Shadows outside of Shadowlands instances and zones. So you can't use it back in Orgrimmar. You can't use it in old raids and stuff. You can't use it in island expeditions. So I'm not 100% sure why this is intended. There are a couple different reasons that could occur to me. So one is that they're worried about something like Door of Shadows breaking old raids or something, or old dungeons. I don't think that is too likely to be the case because stuff like, Void Elf Teleport or just Havoc Demon Hunters existing already do basically the same thing or more than any of the new Covenant abilities. So I don't actually think that that's super likely to be the case. But if it is the case that some combination of Covenant abilities do something weird and game breaking in other content, I think that would be the most reasonable reason to disable them. I think one thing that's maybe more likely is kind of prepping us for them to not be permanent parts of our character's power, right? If you make it so that they don't work in Orgrimmar, you make it so that they don't work in the rest of the world, then in 2 years when Shadowlands ends and we lose all these abilities, maybe it feels a little bit less like we're losing something that was a permanent part of our character, and we're kind of primed to think that it was a Shadowlands only thing. I understand given the blowback they've received about, taking away corruption or all these other effects that they would want to avoid a blowback in the future. I don't actually think that that'll be all that effective. I think people will still feel like they're losing parts of their character's power because, like, in 99% of cases, you're gonna be spending almost all the expansion in all of the areas that Covenant abilities work in. But I think it's just a little. I don't know. I think this is weird and bad. I don't think this is a good thing to do. Like, I don't think just having these buttons not work in random places, right? Like, is really it. I don't think that's how these things should go. I think that I don't see what a good reason is for Covenant abilities to not work in these other places. Like those two possibilities I put forward maybe make some sense, but I don't think that those are really good justifications for our characters just kind of arbitrarily turn off depending on which zone we're in. I guess maybe it's supposed to be the feel of these abilities. The Covenant's lending you their power and it only works in Shadowlands. But again, like, okay, how's it working in Twin Peaks? How's it working in the Orgrimmar arena, but not when I step outside into Orgrimmar proper. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what you guys think about this, but for me, this is this seems like it's not really gonna matter that much, but it's just a bummer. So that's the last bit of news. All right, I'm gonna get out of here. Later.